The champagne glass in my hand was still full when Marcus got down on one knee. Not for me. Never for me. For Vanessa Cole, his chief executive officer, standing under the gold arch we'd paid $42,000 to rent for Castellan Robotics' 5th anniversary gala, at the Wharton Grand Hotel in Austin, Texas. It was March 14, 2024. 280 guests. Investors from 3 continents. And my husband of 11 years, holding a ring box I recognized because I was the one who'd signed the invoice for it, an $86,000 emerald cut from Hendricks & Cole Jewelers, dated February 2, filed under corporate gifting, in our shared expense account. I'd assumed it was for a client. I was wrong. Vanessa, Marcus said, his voice carrying through the room on the wireless mic he'd forgotten to switch off, you built this company with me from nothing. You believed in me when no one else did. Nothing. That word landed in my chest like a dropped plate. I stood near the dessert table with my sister-in-law, Priya, who grabbed my wrist so hard her nails left marks I'd noticed the next morning. Around us, phones rose into the air. Somebody's assistant was already filming vertical video for the company's Instagram. Vanessa's hands covered her mouth. She was 31, a Wharton MBA, hired 18 months earlier as Chief Operating Officer before Marcus promoted her to CEO in November, a promotion the board approved without ever bringing it to me, despite the fact that I held 83% of Castellan Robotics through the trust my late father, Robert Ashworth, had structured in 2016, when he sold his defense manufacturing patents and rolled the proceeds into my name. Marcus knew the number. He'd read the trust documents at our wedding rehearsal dinner, joked that he'd married into serious money, then spent the next decade acting like the company was entirely his invention. He wasn't wrong that he built the technology. He was wrong about who owned it. I set my glass down on the linen tablecloth. My hand didn't shake. That surprised me more than the proposal did. Say something, Priya whispered. I didn't. I watched Vanessa nod, watched Marcus slide the ring onto her finger, watched 280 people applaud a man who, 40 minutes earlier, had introduced me to a table of Singaporean investors as my wife. She handles some of our administrative paperwork. Administrative paperwork. I hold a controlling equity stake worth, as of the last valuation report dated January 9, 2024, approximately $558 million. I have never once corrected him in public. My father taught me that the person who controls the narrative usually isn't the person who needs to. I walked out through the kitchen entrance instead of the ballroom, past a caterer named Dennis who'd worked our anniversary party every year since 2019, and who looked at me with the particular pity reserved for women who've just been humiliated in front of a room full of strangers. In the parking garage, I sat in my car for 11 minutes without starting the engine. Here is what almost nobody at that gala knew. 3 weeks earlier, on February 20th, I'd received a call from our family's estate attorney, Grant Okafor, informing me that Marcus had filed paperwork with the Delaware Secretary of State attempting to restructure Castellan Robotics voting shares, a maneuver that would have diluted my trust stake from 83% down to 12%, folding the difference into a new class of shares controlled by the executive board. The filing had failed. Not because Marcus made a mistake, but because Delaware law required a supermajority shareholder signature to authorize any restructuring of a trust-held controlling interest, and mine was the only signature that mattered. He hadn't asked for it. He'd forged an authorization letter instead, submitted under my name, with a signature that didn't match a single document I'd signed in 18 years. Grant had the forged letter. I had a photograph of the original notarized trust agreement my father signed for months before his heart gave out in our kitchen in Marfa. And now I had 280 witnesses, a viral engagement video, and a fiancé who had no idea she was about to become the public face of a fraud case. My phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. Where did you go? Come back, I want you to meet Vanessa properly. I typed nothing back. Instead I opened my email and reread the message Grant had sent me that morning, one I hadn't answered yet because I hadn't decided how I wanted to use it. Subject, Castellan Robotics, Board Resolution, Confidential. The board, unaware of my ownership percentage because Marcus had spent 6 years keeping shareholder records, simplified, in internal communications, had voted on March 1 to grant Vanessa Cole 2 million shares of founder-class stock as a retention incentive, stock that didn't exist, because founder-class shares had been dissolved under my father's original trust structure back in 2016. They'd built an entire executive promotion, a public engagement, and a projected $1.2 billion Series D funding round on a legal foundation that had never been real. I started the car. Marcus texted again. "Everyone's asking about you. Don't make this weird. Don't make this weird." I drove home to the house on Comel Street that was also, according to the property deed Grant had pulled for me 2 years earlier during a routine estate review, titled solely in my name. I didn't cry that night. I made coffee at 11 p.m., sat at the kitchen table where my father used to review contracts with a red pen, and opened the folder Grant had sent, the forged authorization letter, the dissolved founder share clause, the trust documents, and one thing I hadn't told anyone yet. A voicemail. Left by Vanessa Cole herself, 6 days earlier, on a number she must have thought belonged to Marcus's old assistant. I hadn't listened to it all the way through. I pressed play. The voicemail was 14 seconds of silence before Vanessa's voice broke through. "Marcus, it's me. I know you said the paperwork would clear before the gala, but Okafor's office called our legal team asking about a signature verification. I need you to tell me this is handled. I'm not doing this if there's a real problem with the shares. I have my own name to protect." I played it 4 times. Vanessa didn't sound like a woman stealing a company. She sounded like a woman who'd been told a story and believed it, the same way I'd believed one for 11 years. That distinction mattered to me more than I expected it to at midnight, alone, in a kitchen that still smelled like my father's cedar and tobacco cologne even though he'd been gone since 2019. I called Grant Okafor at 7 a.m. "You listened to the whole file?" he asked. "Twice. Then you know what I know." Marcus told the board the trust restructuring was already approved. He told Vanessa the same thing. He told the Series D investors, in a deck I pulled from the data room last night, that Castellan's ownership was 90% founder-controlled. Grant paused. "There's a line in there, Reina. Slide 14. It lists you as a legacy passive investor, non-voting. Legacy passive investor. 18 years of marriage reduced to a line item." "I want everything," I said. "Every filing, every board minute since November, every email between Marcus and the Delaware registrar. That's going to take time to pull without tipping him off." "How much time?" 2 weeks if we're careful. Faster if you're willing to let him know you're looking." I wasn't. Not yet. Here's what I understood about Marcus that most people didn't: he moved fast when he felt cornered, and slow when he felt safe. If he thought I was still the woman standing frozen by the dessert table, he'd keep making mistakes in writing. The moment he suspected otherwise, every mistake would disappear into a shredder or an offshore server. So I went back to being invisible. I texted him that morning. "Sorry for leaving early. Long day. Congratulations to you both." 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. "Thank you for understanding. I know this is unconventional. Can we talk tonight?" Unconventional. He was calling it unconventional the way you'd call a scheduling conflict unconventional. Not a betrayal. Not a fraud. An inconvenience he expected me to absorb, the same way I'd absorbed 6 years of administrative paperwork jokes at dinner parties. He came home at 8:40 p.m., loosened his tie, and sat across from me at the same table where I'd listened to Vanessa's voicemail 16 hours earlier. "I should have told you about the promotion sooner," he said. "And the engagement, I know the timing looks bad." "The timing looks bad," I repeated. "Vanessa's brilliant, Reina. She's taken Castellan from 40 employees to 312. The Series D term sheet alone puts us at a $1.2 billion valuation. I couldn't have done any of this without her. You didn't do any of it, I said quietly. You did it with my father's patents and my family's trust financing the first for years before you ever brought in outside capital. Marcus's jaw tightened. It was a small movement, one I'd seen exactly twice before in 11 years, once when his own father called him a disappointment at Thanksgiving in 2015, and once when a supplier tried to renegotiate a contract Marcus thought was locked. That was a long time ago, he said. The company's not what it was in 2016. No, I agreed. It's worth considerably more. Which is strange, because according to the cap table you presented to your board in November, my ownership stake somehow shrank from 83% to 12%, and I never signed anything authorizing that. The silence lasted long enough that I could hear the refrigerator hum. There was a restructuring proposal, he said carefully. The board wanted to modernize the equity structure before the funding round. Your signature was on the authorization. It wasn't. Reina. I have 3 notarized signatures on file with Grant Okafor's office, going back to 2016. I have the trust document my father signed for months before he died. And I have a letter submitted to the Delaware Secretary of State in your handling, dated February 20th, with a signature that doesn't match a single one of mine. I kept my voice level. I'd like to know who forged it, or if you did it yourself. Marcus didn't answer the question. He asked one instead. What do you want, Reina? It wasn't an apology. It was a negotiation opening, and I understood in that moment that he still believed this was a problem he could manage, the way he'd managed the board, the way he'd managed Vanessa, the way he'd managed me for 11 years by keeping just enough distance between what I knew and what I could prove. I want to think about it, I said, and went upstairs before he could see that my hands were shaking now, 3 hours after they hadn't been shaking at all. The next morning, Priya called. I did something you're going to be angry about, she said. I talked to Dana in HR, off the record. She told me the board minutes from the November promotion meeting reference a shareholder consent form that nobody in HR has ever actually seen. Dana says Marcus's assistant, Colton, was the only person who handled the physical paperwork. Colton Reyes. 26 years old, hired in 2022, the kind of assistant who remembered everyone's coffee order and nobody's ethics. I drove to the Castellan Robotics office on East 6th Street that afternoon, badge still active because nobody had thought to revoke access for the woman who supposedly only handled administrative paperwork. I found Colton at his desk outside Marcus's office, and I asked him one question. Who notarized the shareholder consent form from November 11th? Colton's face did something complicated. Mrs. Ashworth Cole, I don't think I'm supposed to. I'm not asking you to break confidentiality. I'm asking you to tell me if you personally witnessed my signature being placed on that document. He didn't answer for 11 full seconds. Then he said, so quietly I almost missed it. I printed the signature from a digital template Mr. Ashworth Cole's assistant sent me from a file called Reina_sig_reference. A file. Not a signature. A file extracted from something, saved somewhere, used to forge a legal document that had nearly cost me a controlling interest worth over $500 million. Do you still have that file? Colton's eyes flicked toward Marcus's closed office door. I might have forwarded it to my personal email before IT wiped my work laptop last month, he said. For my own protection. In case anyone ever asked. I sat down in the chair across from his desk. Someone's asking now, I said. Colton forwarded me the file that same afternoon, sitting in his car in the parking garage with the engine off, checking his mirrors like a man who'd finally realized which side of a lawsuit he wanted to be on. The file was named exactly what he'd said, Reina_sig_reference.pdf. Metadata showed it had been created on October 3, 2023, 5 weeks before the board meeting that promoted Vanessa and diluted my shares. Created by user m.ashworthcole. Marcus had built a template of my signature more than a month before he needed it. That single fact told me something the rest of the documents hadn't. This wasn't panic. This wasn't a man making a desperate mistake under Series D pressure. This was planned, sequenced, dated in advance, the kind of thing you do when you've already decided your wife is an obstacle to route around rather than a person to include. I forwarded everything to Grant that night, the file, the metadata, a signed statement from Colton describing exactly how the consent form reached his printer. Grant called me 40 minutes later. "This changes the timeline," he said. "If Marcus commissioned a forged signature template 5 weeks before the board vote, we're not talking about a messy corporate restructuring anymore. We're talking about securities fraud, forgery, and potentially wire fraud if any of the Series D materials went to out-of-state investors referencing false ownership percentages. Could this end with him losing the company? It could end with him losing his freedom, Raina. I need you to understand the weight of what you're sitting on before you decide what you want to do with it." I understood the weight. I'd understood it since I stood by the dessert table watching 280 people applaud a proposal built on a lie I hadn't even fully priced yet. But I wasn't ready to hand this to a courtroom. Not yet. A courtroom would take the decision out of my hands and give it to a judge, a jury, a process that moved at its own pace regardless of what I actually needed, which was for Marcus to understand, specifically and completely, what he had done, not to a faceless legal system, but to me. I spent the next 4 days doing something I'd never done in 11 years of marriage. I watched him. Not followed him. Watched him, the way you watch someone you're about to stop trusting professionally instead of personally, noting patterns, noting the version of himself he performed for different rooms. At home, he was contrite in small, calculated doses. He brought home flowers on March 18th, said almost nothing about Vanessa, asked me twice how I was processing everything, a phrase that sounded like it came from a crisis PR consultant rather than a husband. At the office, according to Priya, who still worked in Castellan's marketing department and had access I didn't advertise, he was telling senior staff that my reaction to the engagement was being handled privately and wouldn't affect the Series D timeline. Handled privately. On March 20th, Grant called with something that made me sit down before he finished the sentence. I pulled the full Series D data room. There's a shareholder representation letter in there, dated March 5th, that states under penalty of perjury that all founder and controlling shareholders have reviewed and consented to the current cap table. It's signed with the same forged signature template. It went to 11 institutional investors, including Bellhaven Capital and Ashford Meridian. 11 investors have a document with my forged signature on it. Yes. Committing to a valuation partly built on shares that legally don't exist. Yes. I thought about the 2 million founder class shares granted to Vanessa, shares dissolved under my father's original trust structure back in 2016, shares that had never legally existed again since. If Bellhaven or Ashford Meridian ever discovered that the ownership structure underpinning a $1.2 billion valuation was fabricated, the fallout wouldn't just hit Marcus. It would hit every employee holding options, every investor holding term sheets, and possibly Vanessa herself, who as CEO had signed off on financial representations she had no idea were false. I thought about her voicemail again. I have my own name to protect. She didn't know. I was almost certain of it now. Which meant if I moved forward the way Grant's instincts wanted me to, filing immediately, alerting the investors, freezing the round, I'd be detonating something that would take down a woman who'd been lied to almost as thoroughly as I had, just from a different angle. That complicated things in a way I hadn't expected. On March 22nd, I finally told Grant what I actually wanted. I don't want a lawsuit that becomes a headline before I control the headline, I said. I want documentation airtight enough that when this becomes public, it's public on my terms, at a moment I choose, in a way that protects the company's employees and gives Vanessa a chance to see the truth before investors do. That's not standard practice. I'm not asking for standard practice. I'm asking what's legally possible. Grant was quiet for a moment. There's a mechanism. As majority trust holder, you can call an emergency shareholder meeting without board approval, provided you give 5 business days notice under the original 2016 trust bylaws Marcus never actually amended, because the restructuring that would have changed them never legally went through. You could present the forged documentation directly to the board, with counsel present, before any of this reaches investors or the press. How fast can we schedule it? I can have the notice filed by Monday. The meeting could happen by April 1st. 11 days. 11 days to gather everything airtight enough that when I walked into that boardroom, there would be no version of events Marcus could talk his way around. I spent that week building a folder Grant called, only half joking, The Reckoning. The forged signature template. Colton's signed statement. The board minutes referencing a consent form nobody in HR had ever verified. The Series D representation letter sent to 11 investors. A financial timeline showing exactly when Marcus began drafting documents that assumed my ownership stake no longer existed. And one more thing, which I found almost by accident on March 26. Priya sent me a screenshot from an internal Slack channel, not Castellan's official system, but a side channel Marcus had created for what he called the transition team, which included Vanessa, Colton, the CFO, and 2 board members but not me. In it, dated back to January 2024, Marcus had written, "Once the restructuring clears, Raina's stake becomes a formality. She's never involved herself in the business day-to-day. She won't fight it. She won't fight it." I read that sentence more times than I read the voicemail. For 11 years, I had chosen to stay quiet in boardrooms I had every legal right to run, because I believed that trust was something you built by not asserting power you didn't need to assert. Marcus had read that choice as weakness. He'd built an entire fraud on the assumption that my silence meant I was absent, rather than simply patient. I forwarded the screenshot to Grant with one line, "Add this to the folder. Then tell me exactly what happens on April 1st if the board sees everything at once." Grant's answer came back within the hour, and it was longer than I expected, walking through voting mechanics, fiduciary exposure, the specific Delaware statute governing majority trust holder authority, and one detail that stopped me cold. Under the original 2016 bylaws, as majority holder, I had the standing right to remove any officer of the company, including the CEO, with a simple majority vote, a vote that, given my 83% stake, I alone constituted. I didn't need the board's permission. I'd never needed it. I closed my laptop, walked into the kitchen, and found Marcus at the table, going through wedding photos from Vanessa's engagement shoot, scheduled, I noticed, for April 3rd, 2 days after the emergency meeting Grant was about to file notice for. "You're quiet lately," Marcus said, not looking up. "I've been thinking about April," I said. "April's going to be a big month. Series D closes, the engagement shoot, maybe we finally talk about the house." "April 1st, I said. "Put it on your calendar." He looked up then, something flickering behind his eyes that hadn't been there in 11 years of me being, in his words, easy to manage. "What's on April 1st? I didn't answer. I let the silence do what 11 years of quiet paperwork jokes had never let me do. The notice went out on March 25th, filed by Grant's office to every member of Castellan Robotics Board, an emergency shareholder meeting, called under Section 4.2 of the original 2016 Trust Bylaws, scheduled for April 1st at 9 a.m., agenda item single and unambiguous, review of shareholder authorization records and officer standing. Marcus called me 11 times between the notice going out and the meeting itself. I answered twice. The first call, he asked what I was doing. I told him I was exercising rights that had belonged to me since 2016. The second call, 4 days later, his voice had changed entirely. Gone was the man who'd told me April would be a big month. In its place was someone negotiating from a position he was only now beginning to understand he didn't hold. "Whatever you think you found," he said, "we can handle this privately. You don't need to bring the board into something between us." "It stopped being between us in October," I said, "when you created a file to forge my signature 5 weeks before you needed it." Silence. "I'll see you Monday," I said and hung up. I spent the weekend with Grant, Priya, and a forensic accountant named Sarah Blum, who Grant had brought in to trace exactly how much of Castellan's projected $1.2 billion valuation depended on fabricated equity. The number she gave us on Sunday night was worse than I'd braced for. Nearly $340 million of that valuation existed only because the cap table falsely represented dissolved founder shares as active, inflating perceived ownership clarity for investors who'd never have signed at that price with the real structure disclosed. If this goes to litigation instead of internal resolution, Sarah said, Belhaven and Ashford Meridian could have grounds to void the entire term sheet. The company could lose the round entirely, not just Marcus's position in it. I know, I said. Employees have options tied to that valuation. I know that too. It was the reason I hadn't gone to the SEC the moment Grant handed me Colton's statement. 312 employees, most of whom had nothing to do with what Marcus built in a side Slack channel with a name like the Transition Team, stood to lose real money if I let this become a public detonation instead of a controlled correction. I wanted Marcus removed. I didn't want to burn down everything my father's patents and 6 years of other people's honest work had built around him. Monday morning, I walked into the Castellan Robotics boardroom on the 14th floor of the building on East 6th Street wearing a navy suit I hadn't worn since my father's funeral, carrying a folder Grant had assembled into something closer to a legal filing than a presentation. 9 board members sat around the table. Marcus sat at the head, jaw set, a lawyer beside him I didn't recognize. Vanessa sat 2 seats down, and when she saw me, something crossed her face that told me everything I needed to know about how much she'd actually understood before that morning. Grant opened with the trust bylaws, establishing on the record that I held 83% controlling interest, and had never authorized any restructuring. Then he placed the forged signature template on the screen, dated October 3, 5 weeks before the November board vote. This is the file used to generate the shareholder consent form presented to this board on November 11, Grant said. It was created by Marcus Ashworth Cole's user account. It was printed by his assistant, Colton Reyes, whose signed statement is included in the packet in front of you. No authentic signature from the majority trust holder exists on any restructuring document filed with the state of Delaware. One board member, a man named Harrison Bell who'd sat on Castellan's board since 2019, looked up from the folder. This means the November promotion and the entire founder share allocation never legally occurred, Grant said. Which also means the shareholder representation letter sent to 11 Series D investors on March 5 contains a securities misstatement, made under a forged signature, regarding an ownership structure that does not exist. The room went very quiet. Vanessa's hand had gone still on the table in front of her. Marcus's lawyer started to speak. I didn't let him finish. I'm not here to destroy this company, I said, and it was the first time I'd spoken since walking in. My father built the patents this company still runs on. I've watched people in this room work for 6 years building something real on top of that. I'm not interested in taking that away from 312 employees, who had nothing to do with a signature forged in October. I looked at Marcus directly for the first time that morning. I am interested in the fact that you built a file to fake my consent before you'd even decided you needed it. That you told your board I'd never fight it. That you let a woman across this table sign a legal representation to 11 investors without telling her the ownership structure underneath it was fiction. Vanessa's eyes moved to Marcus. He didn't look at her. As majority trust holder, I continued, I'm exercising my right under Section 4.2 to remove Marcus Ashworth Cole as Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately, and to void the November restructuring vote and the March 5 investor representation in full. You can't just, Marcus started. I can, I said. I've always been able to. I chose not to for 11 years because I believed a company runs better when the people building it feel trusted. You read that as absence. It wasn't. The vote, given my stake, was a formality that still had to be read into the record. It passed 1-0, my single vote constituting the required majority, with the rest of the board abstaining in stunned silence rather than opposing it. Harrison Bell was the one who finally spoke into the quiet afterward. What happens to the Series D round? I've already spoken with Belhaven and Ashford Meridian's counsel, Grant said. Both firms have agreed to a 45-day pause to allow a corrected cap table and a restated representation letter, signed authentically, to go out this week. Neither fund has indicated an intention to withdraw, provided the correction happens transparently and promptly. I hadn't told Marcus that part. I'd spent the previous Thursday on calls with both funds myself, walking them through exactly what happened and exactly what I intended to do about it, because I understood something Marcus never had, that investors don't leave over a founder's failure nearly as often as they leave over a founder's cover-up. Honesty, offered early and completely, was worth more to them than the fiction he'd been protecting. Vanessa asked to speak to me privately afterward, in the small conference room down the hall. She looked like someone who'd aged through several years in the span of one meeting. I didn't know, she said. About the signature. About any of it. I believe you, I said, and meant it. I heard your voicemail. The one about protecting your own name. Her face went pale. How did you? It doesn't matter how. What matters is you're the one who told him you weren't doing this if there was a real problem with the shares. You were right to ask. He just never told you the answer. What happens to me? That's not entirely my decision. The board will need to decide whether you stay on as CEO under corrected terms, given you had no knowledge of the fraud. I'd support that if you want it. But the engagement, I paused, choosing the next words carefully, because I didn't feel triumphant standing across from her, only tired. That's between you and whatever you decide he actually is, now that you've seen this. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. I watched something settle behind her eyes that told me she already knew. Marcus found me in the parking garage 2 hours later, the same garage where I'd sat for 11 minutes without starting my car 3 weeks earlier. You planned this for a month, he said. It wasn't an accusation. It sounded almost like respect, twisted through anger. You planned yours for 5 weeks longer than mine, I said. October 3rd. That's when you built the file. He didn't deny it. Somewhere in the last hour, denial had stopped being useful to him. What do you want, Reina? He asked again, the same question from 3 weeks earlier, except this time there was nothing left for him to negotiate with. I want the company to survive what you did to it, I said. I want Vanessa to have a real choice about her career, one you never gave her about the truth. And I want a divorce. He flinched at the last word more than he had at anything Grant presented in the boardroom. 11 years, he said. 11 years where you thought silence meant I wasn't paying attention, I said. I was always paying attention. I just never needed to prove it to you before. I drove home that night to the house on Comel Street, titled solely in my name, and sat at the kitchen table where my father used to review contracts with a red pen. Grant called around 9 to tell me the restated representation letter had gone out to all 11 investors, and that Belhaven's managing partner had personally called to say the correction, handled this openly, actually strengthened their confidence in the company's governance going forward. Castellan Robotics didn't collapse. 312 employees kept their jobs, their options recalculated on an honest cap table instead of a fabricated one. The board appointed an interim CEO within 2 weeks, and Vanessa, after taking a month to decide what she wanted, returned in a restructured chief operating officer role, the one she'd actually earned before Marcus gave her a title built on a lie neither of them had a right to. I filed for divorce on April 8. Marcus didn't contest the settlement, because there was very little left for him to contest with a forged signature file sitting in a folder Grant kept in a locked drawer, ready for a courtroom neither of us wanted to walk into if it could be avoided. My father used to say that the people who talk the least in a room are usually the ones who could end it fastest, if they ever decided to. I used to think that was a compliment about patience. I understand now it was a warning about what happens when someone mistakes your silence for permission.